They say history is written by the victors, but some stories are buried so deep that even the textbooks refuse to whisper them. Beneath Canada's polished image of maple leaves, polite society, and peaceful coexistence lies a shadowed past, one that challenges everything we think we know, from erased rebellions to silenced voices. Canada's history is a labyrinth of secrets, conveniently left out of classrooms and documentaries. Long before the bustling cities and sprawling highways, vast lands were home to thriving indigenous civilizations, rich in culture, law, and tradition. When European settlers arrived, alliances were made and broken, treaties signed and ignored. Entire communities were displaced, their sacred lands taken, and their stories reshaped into sanitized versions that suited the narrative of a peaceful expansion. But the suppression didn't stop there. In remote areas, governments conducted experiments under the guise of progress, targeting marginalized groups with policies that would shock the modern conscience. The evidence, meticulously hidden in archives, speaks of forced relocations, cultural erasure, and state-sanctioned violence. Even events celebrated as national achievements often had a darker, unspoken cost, one paid in silence, suffering, and the disappearance of truths that might have reshaped a nation's conscience. The forbidden chapters of Canada's history aren't just footnotes, they are warnings. They remind us that the story of any country is never just what is taught, it's also what is left unsaid. To uncover it is to confront uncomfortable truths, to acknowledge the layers of injustice, and to challenge the idea that history is ever truly settled. Because the past, no matter how carefully hidden, always has a way of resurfacing. History is never neutral, and what we are taught often reflects the interests of those who hold power rather than those who suffered under it. In Canada's case, the official version of history taught in classrooms and celebrated in national holidays presents a portrait of unity, peace, and progress. But beneath that surface lies a deliberate act of omission, where uncomfortable truths are carefully filtered out to preserve a sense of national innocence. The process of selecting which events to highlight and which to forget is not accidental. It is a calculated form of control that shapes how citizens perceive their country and its moral standing in the world. This selective storytelling hides the pain of those who were oppressed and glorifies the achievements of those who benefited from colonization. By focusing on polite diplomacy, industrial growth, and multiculturalism, the narrative conveniently avoids discussions of genocide, forced assimilation, and exploitation. It tells a story of harmony, not conquest, of cooperation, not resistance. The purpose is clear: to maintain pride and cohesion while suppressing guilt and accountability. The result is a population that grows up believing their nation's hands are clean, unaware of the systemic injustices that built the foundation of modern Canada. Textbooks, museums, and monuments reinforce this illusion, presenting a curated history that feels complete but is deeply fragmented. Each omission is a quiet act of denial, allowing the cycle of misunderstanding and complacency to continue generation after generation. The power to shape memory becomes a tool of governance, creating citizens who accept myths as truths. Once people begin to question what they were taught, they realize how much was hidden in plain sight, how the stories of resistance, survival, and courage from marginalized communities were replaced by narratives of benevolent colonizers and inevitable progress. Recognizing this manipulation of history is the first step toward understanding that knowledge itself can be a form of control, and that truth, when buried, can distort the conscience of an entire nation. Long before Canada became a nation, the land was home to thriving indigenous civilizations with complex systems of governance, trade, and spirituality deeply connected to the natural world. These communities had their own laws, languages, and traditions that had sustained them for thousands of years. When European settlers arrived, they entered into treaties that were meant to establish mutual respect and coexistence, but these agreements were quickly broken or manipulated in favor of colonial expansion. Promises made to protect indigenous lands and rights were replaced by policies that prioritized settlement, resource extraction, and the establishment of European control. As settlers spread across the continent, indigenous peoples were systematically displaced from their ancestral territories through deceit, coercion, and sometimes outright violence. Lands that once provided sustenance and spiritual connection were fenced off, sold, or industrialized, leaving communities uprooted and dependent on a government that had stripped them of autonomy. The breaking of treaties was not a series of isolated betrayals. It was a structured campaign to dismantle indigenous sovereignty and assimilate their people into a colonial framework that viewed them as obstacles rather than partners. The damage went beyond land theft. It extended to the deliberate destruction of cultural identity. Children were taken from their families and sent to residential schools where they were forbidden to speak their languages or practice their traditions, ensuring that generations grew up detached from their roots. The trauma of these experiences still echoes through indigenous communities today, reflected in struggles for recognition, land rights, and justice. Yet, much of this history remains diluted in education systems that speak vaguely of settlement and nation building without confronting the human cost. The narrative of peaceful coexistence overshadows the reality of displacement and broken promises, maintaining the illusion of a benevolent colonization. To acknowledge the truth of these betrayals is to confront a moral debt that Canada has yet to repay, one that continues to shape the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the state, revealing that the country's foundation was built not on harmony, but on dispossession and deception. Throughout Canada's history, certain voices have been deliberately silenced, their stories buried beneath layers of official narratives that favor the dominant culture. The suppression of marginalized voices was not simply neglect, but an intentional act of control meant to define who was worthy of being remembered and who was not. Indigenous peoples, Black Canadians, immigrants, and other marginalized groups were often written out of history books, their contributions reduced to footnotes or ignored altogether. This erasure created a distorted national identity that celebrated progress while concealing the oppression and exclusion that made that progress possible. Governments and institutions enforced silence through laws, censorship, and social pressure, discouraging dissenting narratives that challenged the image of a fair and just nation. Journalists, activists, and community leaders who tried to expose injustices often faced harassment or were labeled as troublemakers, ensuring that the majority of Canadians would never hear their side of the story. The education system reinforced this silence by teaching generations of students a version of history that glorified explorers and politicians, while overlooking the resistance and resilience of those who suffered under their policies. Even cultural contributions by marginalized communities were often appropriated or stripped of context, presented as symbols of diversity, while the people behind them remained invisible. This silencing extended beyond words to the physical realm, where sacred sites were destroyed, archives destroyed, and languages deliberately suppressed to weaken cultural memory. When voices are erased, the truth becomes fragmented, and the nation's understanding of itself becomes incomplete. The result is a population conditioned to accept a one-dimensional version of Canada, one that celebrates tolerance and equality without reckoning with the systemic injustices that contradict those ideals. The stories that were silenced still exist, carried through oral traditions, hidden archives, and the memories of survivors who refuse to be forgotten. Their reemergence in recent years represents more than historical correction. It is an act of reclamation, a demand for acknowledgement, and a challenge to a society that built its pride on selective memory. To hear these voices is to confront what was buried and to realize that silence, too, is a form of violence. In the name of progress, Canada's governments once implemented policies that were framed as necessary for modernization, but in truth, inflicted deep harm on the very people they claimed to help. Across remote and marginalized regions, so-called development programs and scientific experiments were carried out without consent, often targeting Indigenous communities, the poor, and other vulnerable groups. These actions were justified as steps toward social improvement or national security, but they concealed a darker intent, the desire to control populations and erase cultural differences deemed inconvenient to the colonial vision. Entire communities were relocated from their ancestral territories under the pretext of economic opportunity or environmental necessity, only to find themselves isolated in barren lands where survival was a struggle. The government's interventions in education, healthcare, and housing were often accompanied by exploitation and neglect, producing generations of trauma that continue to shape lives today. Medical experiments were conducted without proper consent. Children were subjected to malnutrition studies in residential schools, and Inuit families were forcibly moved to the Arctic to assert sovereignty over distant lands. Each act was justified as progress, but the cost was paid in suffering, identity loss, and generational pain. The same logic was used to rationalize environmental destruction, where sacred lands were stripped for resources under the banner of national development. This version of progress was one-sided, benefiting the powerful while erasing the humanity of those who stood in its way. It was an ideology that equated modernization with domination, framing exploitation as advancement and cultural annihilation as civilization. The official records of these projects often omitted their human toll, portraying them as necessary sacrifices for the greater good. Only decades later did survivors and researchers uncover the truth, revealing that progress had been a mask for oppression. These hidden injustices expose a moral contradiction at the heart of Canada's history. A nation that prides itself on fairness and compassion built much of its modern identity through policies that inflicted suffering in silence. The legacy of these acts remains embedded in social inequalities, reminding us that progress without humanity is not progress at all, but another form of conquest. The stories that Canada celebrates as milestones of national pride often hide painful truths buried beneath the surface of progress. Every achievement, whether the building of railways, the establishment of industry, or the expansion of cities, came at a cost that is rarely acknowledged. The construction of the Transcontinental Railway, for instance, is hailed as a symbol of unity and innovation. Yet it relied on the exploitation of Chinese laborers who endured brutal conditions, starvation, and death without recognition. Industrial expansion that fueled economic prosperity devastated indigenous lands and ecosystems, forcing communities into poverty and dependence. Policies praised as steps toward national growth often deepened inequality, dividing society between those who prospered and those who paid the price for that prosperity. Even in moments of supposed progress, such as the introduction of new laws or institutions, marginalized groups were excluded from their benefits or directly harmed by their implementation. The government's pursuit of modernization often meant stripping others of their rights, their land, and their identity. Behind every celebrated victory lies a parallel story of suffering, one that the official record rarely acknowledges. Canada's peaceful image was built on policies of assimilation, displacement, and control, all justified under the language of improvement and civilization. Schools taught children to admire explorers and political leaders without revealing that their actions destroyed entire cultures and communities. Museums and monuments glorified conquest while ignoring the human toll it demanded. This selective memory turned victims into footnotes and perpetrators into heroes, shaping a national narrative that felt proud but incomplete. The hidden cost of progress was not only material, it was psychological, cultural, and moral. Generations grew up believing in the myth of benevolence, unaware that the foundations of their society were laid upon exploitation and erasure. The achievements that define Canada's identity are inseparable from the injustices that enabled them, and until the nation confronts both sides of its history with honesty, it cannot claim true progress. The forgotten sacrifices behind celebrated accomplishments remind us that every advancement built on inequality carries with it a debt of truth waiting to be paid. No matter how carefully a nation tries to conceal its darkest chapters, the past has a way of returning to demand acknowledgement. Canada's forbidden history, long suppressed through silence and selective education, continues to resurface through survivors' testimonies, uncovered archives, and the persistence of truth seekers who refuse to let memory die. The illusion of a spotless national record is slowly unraveling as people confront the evidence of what was hidden. Residential school graves, broken treaties, and the stories of communities erased from official accounts. The resurfacing of these truths challenges the comforting myths that generations were taught to believe, forcing society to reckon with the moral contradictions of its own identity. Each revelation shakes the foundations of national pride, reminding Canadians that progress built on denial cannot last. The truth may be uncomfortable, but it is also liberating, for it allows healing to begin where lies once stood. The rediscovery of silenced histories is not simply about assigning blame, it is about restoring humanity to those who were deliberately forgotten. As descendants of survivors and historians piece together the fragments of truth, the narrative that once upheld Canada's innocence begins to crumble, replaced by a more honest understanding of how injustice shaped a nation. The power of the past lies in its persistence. It lingers in landscapes, in memories, in languages once banned but now revived. Attempts to erase history only make its return more powerful, as the voices once silent speak louder with every generation that uncovers them. Facing this truth requires courage, for it exposes the hypocrisy of a nation that prides itself on equality and compassion while built upon exclusion and suffering. Yet acknowledgement is not a threat to Canada's identity. It is the only path toward an authentic one. The forbidden history that resurfaces is not an enemy of progress, but its conscience, reminding society that justice delayed is never justice denied. Every buried story that emerges pulls the nation closer to understanding itself, proving that the past is never truly past. It waits patiently for the moment it will finally be heard.